Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. Well, hello again. I'm Joe Walensky, and here we are for another episode where I get to meet an accessibility practitioner. And today I'm pleased to be chatting with Purnima Subramanian. Hello, Purnima. How are you doing today?
Hello, Joe. I'm doing good. Thanks for asking. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. It's kind of a rainy week at my home office on Vashon Island, which is near the Blink headquarters in Seattle, Washington. Where are you talking to us from?
So I'm here. I'm living here in Concord, North Carolina. So the weather it's like both cold and sunny. But yeah, not pretty bad though for the winter.
Well, good place to start is if you could just tell us a little bit about your current position, the types of things that you're responsible for.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a digital accessibility SME. Um, so I'm the subject matter expert on digital accessibility and in my current company at a Holland America Group. So it is a travel industry where I actually represent the accessibility compliance and also for the accessibility experience for all of our Holland America cruise digital websites that includes Princess Cruises, Holland America Line, and Seabourn Cruise brands. So yeah, I'm like my role is more of like being a accessibility point of contact and the subject matter experts to work with the various teams that includes design team, development team, and also the vendors who are actually hosting content in our brand websites to to educate and also to ensure that the end product is accessible and meeting all the VCAG guidelines, which is the core basic of the accessibility compliance. So apart from the compliance, talking about from the user experience, it is very important for our customers. You know, for each one of our customers, I would just like to insist that they whom our accessing our brand website they wanted to feel that they are being inclusive, they feel that yeah, this website is for us. I can do anything online, that you can start from booking for a cruise, or else access your boarding pass. And when you are all set to sail in the cruise, make sure that you have your application and the website and you log in already, and and make sure that that websites are accessible for everyone. So there are people who are having color blindness, there are people who may have who may be using the screen readers, and there are people who are in the aging category, who are I would like to call it 60 years and older, they may have various forms of disabilities, but that's not going to stop anyone to access the web. So that is what I am here in my company. I'm in the position that to make sure that our digital products are accessible to everyone.
Well, one of the things that I like to do is find out the journeys that brought people to the work that they do today. So, if we go back in time, what would be one of the first places that you became aware of accessibility in started thinking about being involved with that?
Yeah. So talking about my, I'm going back, I think before 10 years, I would say, like, I stepped onto this digital accessibility space in, I would say, like, I mean, 2007, where I joined, in a center of excellence team in my XX company, the company named Cognizant. So they have actually, like, they have been like, creating a new team that's called non-functional center of excellence. So that includes various types of services, like security, web security, and then accessibility, performance, and disaster recovery, and there are other names as well. But somehow I chose to be the part of digital accessibility. But to be honest, like, I was a total newbie who was wondering, like, whether people with disabilities can even access a web. So that was, like, back in 12 years, say 2007. So I started learning about different types of disabilities, and how people are really using the web, how they can use the web. Like, that was the question on my mind. And, like, I started exploring on that, and learned about the the accessibility guidelines and bylaws that they were available in the digital space, to make sure that they could satisfy that. And uh, and also, like, the facts about, like, the assistive technologies that people are using, to communicate with the computer, right? That is one thing that was the biggest challenge when I started, like, to learn about the assistive technologies. How does that work? And how do we actually test it with our products to see, because bringing in the real user experience is not quite easy. So, learning about the assistive technologies. But yeah, I mean, I think I tried my best to learn about assistive technologies at that time. So, and then, my learning was like an incremental learning process, where, I met a person actually in one of my previous company, like, client place, where the person is, like, is in a wheelchair, who was actually using the web. So he was actually, like, talking about his experience of, how he interacts with the web. So that makes me, like, really, surprising, and also at the same time, like, yeah, I mean, it can be done, right? So that's the part, like, where I came into, when I decided that, like, okay, I'm not leaving this as still accessibility space, because whatever work I do, like, I always feel passionate about it, and also, like, that makes me feel good in a good cause, right? So it started from there, and then I moved on to, like, to the banking
Let me
sector.
just let me just jump
Yeah,
in, stop you there for a minute.
sure.
And so what type of work were you doing at that time? Are you able to talk about your position, or what you were being employed for when you first started getting involved with that?
Sure. I was actually, I was starting as an accessibility tester, where, like, I was employed, like, to do most of the testing services. So that means, like, you need to understand about the testing guidelines, and also the, like, the testing with assistive technologies. So those two things, like, are where, like, where I started my accessibility career. And then, like, when it comes to the screen reader, like, when I turned on JAWS, like, it used to talk. And I'm not quite sure, like, how, okay, should I use tab and just the enter and the space bar? But then, like, I realized there are, like, I mean, various keyboard shortcuts that are available for the users that access a quick navigation mechanism for people who are blind, like, to interact with the web. That was quite amazing, like, to learn about the screen readers. And then it's and also, like, it's a fact that I always wanted to say to anyone, like, whomever I work with. So when we say accessibility, it's not just about screen readers. So there are many other, like, assistive technologies, and also the, like, the operating system settings that people use in their day-to-day life when they actually communicate with the web. So that's one thing. So when we take, like, I mean, just, it's not, when we say it's not just about the screen reader, like, there are about the zooming, like, we need to make sure that, like, that people who are having low vision, they can, access the web. I can, even as a normal person, I used to prefer just to zoom and see whether I can see the content clearly, right? So that's one thing. And then, people who cannot use a mouse and, who actually prefer to work with a keyboard, and they have keyboard set up in a way that, they could access. So those are all also considered into that. So it was quite a time, it actually took me a good amount of time to learn about different kinds of disabilities that this digital accessibility focusing on, and how it actually impacts various lives, and to see in their day-to-day lives, right, of accessing web. Because accessing web, it's not just it's now becoming in our like a core thing, right? And especially when for people who are in the aging category, they prefer to do their work where they are, right? In sitting in where they are. So that is one other thing that we could think of.
Well, getting started as a tester, I think for a lot of people coming into accessibility is a great place to start, because you're working with assistive technologies, as you said, and so you're understanding what the challenges are. You mentioned that then you started working as a subject matter expert. So how do you define that, and what changed about your role as you started doing that type of work?
Yeah, sure. So as as I said, I started as a tester, and then when I actually joined a new company, which is a banking industry. So where I started learning about the strategies, of how to implement the accessibility, right? Best practices. So it doesn't I was understanding it's more of my understanding was just to test it with this assistive technologies and see if it passes the guidelines, but it's not. So when it comes the to the strategies that actually implements the digital accessibility, to make sure the product is accessible, it actually starts in the design phase. So the design phase is one of the core phase, I would say. The best practices, it's not a long list that they have, but still it makes a lot of difference when you have the accessibility best practices integrated in your design stage. So that's where I started working with the design teams to understand how we can make little things delivered in an accessible way, show it up in an accessible way that actually made a lot of difference. For an example, when you have just this small example, I just would like to say, when you have say you have a section called personal information where you fill out the form, and you have labels, right? So in one of the forms that our design team were designing, that they were actually giving out as a placeholders. But when I start typing in, I'm not seeing the label anymore, because there are two different date categories. One is the birth date, and one is your passport expiry date. And it's I'm a little confused to understand, okay, which is my birth date and which is my, it's like it's little it's not giving me a clue. Or so that's where we need to start addressing in the design stage itself, to make sure that we are having the visual labels. So this is just one of the examples where we could actually start addressing to best point out that design stage is the is a core phase of integrating accessibility in your digital products. And that's where it starts. And then moving on from design to development, we actually instead of testing the products after developing, I love to educate the developers about what needs to be done, and what are the accessibility guidelines, and why it is needed, right? So these three things, I always like to conduct as a workshop. I'm never tired of talking about this with my developers. So once they get to the understanding of why it is needed, then there will be no question of how I can address it, right? So there are different frameworks, like we have the ARIA frameworks that needs to be integrated into development, which may or may not be aware by the development team yet. Like if you like if you're ready to as an accessibility SME or specialist, or based on your role in the accessibility, and if you're ready to explain to the developer, like in just a novice form, just say that why it is needed, how the screen reader works, right? And how the what is expected in the zooming, and what is expected in the speech recognition, right? And what do I need from the keyboard point of view? So those factors, I try to explain to them and make sure that at least they understand to the extent that why they are doing that. So that actually helped me a lot in my projects that I have done to bring out a good accessible product, I would say to a good extent. So after that, of course, the testing phase. So the testing phase, where you would actually do the testing to make sure that the product is accessible. And also, and when we talk about the testing, there are different kinds, where you do the automation testing and the manual testing. So as accessibility is like a human interpreted a framework, the automation tool is not going to do all the work for you. So it's the automation only covers some 40 30 to 40 percentage of testing the markup of the brand sites, right, the website. But the manual testing is what going to give you a good idea of saying that, hey, if this product is going to be accessible to the end user or not, right? So that is what important here. So and then doing the manual testing, and then to after once it is done, to see that yeah we are getting the product as accessible that makes everyone's happy. And also of course to our customers, right, or to the end users who are using the websites. That's where they are feeling that, okay, I mean it is included, right? So that means and we're not using any separate widgets or something to make it accessible, and it's like a normal user, how I use with the screen reader, it's not making any difference for me, so I can access the website as how the other user does. So that is what that difference is what I mean calling out, and also making me feel to play my role as an accessibility specialist.
Well, so you obviously, we have a wide spectrum of activities that you're involved in, and that's always rewarding to get involved in the early stages with design
Right.
before the code is in place. One of the things that I find interesting about the type of service that you provide is that your customers are not only working with the digital part of the process, but the whole point of it is, I assume, to be involved in a physical activity of travel, and so there's that whole part of it. And so, does that come into your design thought at all about how the work that you're doing on the digital side merges with the actual experience people have in taking a trip?
Yeah, so I would in my current position, I can talk about when you have your digital web accessible. For an example, I wanted to chat, or I'm ready to book a cruise, and say there is a end user, there's a customer who are using the screen reader, and then he decided to taking booking a cruise to our cruise website. And if and also I wanted to chat about the cruise deals, without actually visiting the cruise representative, the office or the customer center, where I actually or the agent itself, where I could get more details. But then so the chat feature, that is available in our cruise website, that makes the customer, easy, that they could, chat with the cruise representative online, and ask about the questions that he has, and then get details about the cruise deals. And once he finds that, yeah, it's all good, he can directly go and book it online. So he can save the trip, visiting the cruise agent, and getting about the, and just to know about the cruise deals, right? So that's one thing I find, where I mean, our the website, definitely helps people, with disabilities, who wants to, save a trip to, by actually visiting the office itself. So that's one thing. And also in the banking, back to the the banking industry where I worked for a bank, you know the one example that I could find is the mobile deposit. So that's a cool feature that's now available in the app itself, where once you have a check, I wanted to, okay, go and deposit it. Okay, I have to, go to the bank so that the banker can help me. But that is I can say, in almost all the app now, there is an option called mobile deposit, right? So you can actually make it work. It's pretty intuitive in a way that, anyone can do the mobile deposit, and even with the screen reader, it announces all the instructions as it had to say that, hey, place the check, and turn on to this angle, and then use the darker background. So that gives a clear picture of, for the customers to deposit the checks online. And that definitely, saves a trip to visit the banker itself.
Well, with your experience with accessibility, you've probably seen a lot of things that have moved in a positive direction. Maybe some things that haven't moved as quickly as you thought they would. As you look forward into the future, what are some of the things that you're looking forward to seeing in accessibility?
Yeah. So in future, I would like to, see this digital accessibility grow and expand. It's not just, in the company that I work in, right? But I also, I I'm seeing, there are, I mean, the awareness about the digital accessibility, it's coming out more and more, and from different types of people, and who are working either in the physical, or, or in the digital space. So, they, as they get to understand more, they would actually, they can implement that more, right? They can make it work, so they can make a difference. So that's the only thing. So I think in the future also, I am I'm planning to contribute more towards the workshops, or, to the webinars, mostly on educating things, because that's the one part that, I always love to do. So irrespective of, who was, working in which space, then it definitely, help them, and also, helps me to make me feel good, I'm doing the right thing, right? So that's the one thing, I wanted to do. So growing, and also, empowering, I would say. The digital accessibility, make it as a standard, make it as a default. We're not doing, any, bringing any kind of, magic here, to call accessibility as a separate thing. No, it is an inclusive practice. So we just wanted to, make that inclusive, and I wanted to see that happen in my future. And yeah, I will definitely, contribute to my best, in the digital accessibility space, to make that happen.
Well, Purnima, thank you so much for taking the time to share your journey into accessibility. It's been a great story to hear about the different activities that you've been working on, and look forward to meeting you sometime in the real world in the future.